And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. We are up in our New York City studio, and we're interviewing professors from New York University about some of their books. Joining us now is Peter Blair Henry. Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth is the name of his book, but he's also the dean of New York University's Leonard Stern School of Business. Who was Leonard Stern?
Leonard Stern is a benefactor of the school. He's a investor in New York City. He started with Hart's Mountain, what was a pet food company, grew it into a large real estate empire, has served at the NYU Board of Trustees in the past, and is currently a member of the Stern Board of Overseers, and is a very generous benefactor of the school. In 1988, gave a very large gift to the tune of $25 million that allowed the business school, which was then divided into two schools, the graduate school and the undergraduate program, to be unified in one place on Washington Square.
Professor Henry, does the Stern School of Business have a philosophy?
We do. We capture in really a very one simple sentence. Our mission is to develop people and ideas who can transform the challenges of the 21st century into opportunities to create value for business and society. In other words, you can use the tools of modern business to do both, do well, and to do good in the world.
And your book, Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth. What's a lesson that a first world country like the U.S. can learn from the third world?
Well, there are really three key lessons that in general first world countries can learn from the history of third world countries' struggle to become what are now called emerging markets. And those three lessons are what I call discipline, clarity, and trust. So let me give you a very specific example. In the case of the United States, there's a really good example. So what does discipline mean? Discipline does not mean, for instance, fiscal austerity. So we had a fight over the last few years about fiscal policy, which gave us sequestration, and that really had some negative effects, led to slower growth in our economy. But the reason why we ended up in that place in the first place is because the United States failed to learn the lesson that countries like Chile taught us, which is that if you want to run good economic policy, on the fiscal side of the house, taxes and spending, you need to save when times are good so that you have money to spend when times are bad. In other words, fiscal policy is no more complicated than the story of the ant and the grasshopper. So take Chile. In 2000 and early 2000s, the Chilean economy was booming because of copper prices were rising. And so the treasury was being swelled with the revenue. And so by 2006, Chile had a record surplus on hand. And the people of Chile took to the streets and marched and burned in effigy the finance minister, a gentleman by the name of Andres Velasco, and said, basically, give us the money. Give the people the surplus. Velasco said, no, this is money for a rainy day. And so when the financial crisis hit in 2008, Chile was able to institute a series of tax cut packages and subsidies to stimulate the economy and keep things moving without running large deficits that got people worried about their long-term financial health. Contrast the United States. In 2001, in 2001, we had an election which led to a large tax cut package. We gave the people their money back, so to speak, and then were hit by a series of wars and other shocks that led to large deficits. And hence, we ended up being in a situation where we were faced with looming deficits and this fight and sequestration, which was very damaging to our economic policy. So had we saved, and by the way, it's not a partisan point I'm making, had Al Gore won the election rather than George W. Bush, we might have seen the record surpluses that we ran in the Clinton years disappear in the form of higher spending rather than lower taxes. So it's not a partisan point. The point is, fiscal discipline means saving for a rainy day, and we didn't do that. We didn't learn the lesson that a country like Chile has to teach us, for example.
So there's the discipline matter. What about the other two?
Well, clarity. Countries that turned themselves around were able to do so. Third world countries that became emerging markets were able to turn themselves around because their leaders demonstrated a clear commitment to a change of direction. If you look at Europe at the moment, for instance, we have the following set of mixed messages coming out from the leadership. On the one hand, you have economies that have been in recession, that are struggling to recover, and Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, saying we need to do whatever is necessary on the monetary side to stimulate the economy, starting with what are called outright monetary transactions and a range of other acronyms that I won't go into on the air here. But the point is really expansive monetary policy. But on the other side, on the fiscal side, Europe has engaged in the European Fiscal Compact, which says that deficits need to be reduced to a certain threshold, below 3% of GDP, almost immediately. And so you have fiscal policy working against monetary policy, and that's a lack of clarity. And that lack of clarity about the direction of the economy is damaging to growth, because investors don't know how to think about the future, and consumers also don't know what the plan is. And so that lack of clarity, which, by the way, we were plagued by the same problem under sequestration, because we had all of this expansionary, creative monetary policy under Ben Bernanke, but then tight fiscal policy.
Discipline, clarity.
And trust is the third point. Discipline and clarity produce trust. And economies move at the speed of trust. In other words, in a modern economy where we have capital markets that can allocate financial resources from people who have excess savings to people who have good investment projects that can generate economic growth. Those transactions, we don't have to know each other for that transaction to take place, as long as there's trust. The capital markets can do the intermediation. But when there's a lack of trust in the economy, when there's a lack of clarity about economic policy, there's a lack of discipline, a lack of focus on the future, then that undermines trust, and that undermines people's confidence in economic policy and investment. So very specifically, if you think about the US economy, we are still, in terms of investment, investment as a fraction of GDP is still far below where it was during the peak of our strong growth years in 2006. And part of the reason why investment, when I say investment, I mean real capital investment, building of new factories, investment in computers and new IT equipment, that is still below where we were during our peak years. And part of the reason for that is the lack of clarity and lack of discipline, uncertainty about the future, and therefore a lack of trust.
You talk about all this, Professor Henry, but the U.S. economy, still the biggest in the world. There is some growth in it. Europe, stuck at 10, 12% unemployment in many cases. Mm-hmm. What can the world learn from the U.S.?
Well, here's the key point. The United States economy is growing again. But as you mentioned, Europe isn't growing, and the United States, and we are not really back on track. And we're in a situation where we're living with diminished expectations about the future. In other words, we're underperforming. And this is a lesson that applies both to the advanced economies and, by the way, also to the emerging markets. So the emerging markets during the past 4 years, where we've had really unconventional monetary policy and a relatively quiescent period, have not taken full advantage of that window of expansionary monetary policy to implement in their own economies key reforms like greater investment in infrastructure in some cases, financial sector reform in places like India, dealing with key impediments in the labor market. Those are key reforms that you want to undertake when times are good so that you can begin to unleash the growth process. And so emerging markets, even though they learned many of these lessons in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, they themselves need to stick to what I call the long road of discipline and continue to implement policy changes that are going to allow them to grow. As far as the United States and Europe, yes, the U.S. is growing again, but we haven't dealt with, for instance, one of the key issues facing the United States is rising income inequality. Rising income inequality in the United States is fomenting a lot of discontent, fomenting a lot of hard feeling towards those who are doing well by those who are not doing well. And what we know